Good morning. Welcome to Georgetown. I'm Michael Kessler, Executive Director of the Berkeley Center and a professor in the Government Department and the Law Center. On behalf of my colleagues at the Berkeley Center, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this conference, Caring for the Other, Refugees and Displaced Persons. We live in perilous times. Nowhere is this more evident than to witness the plight of vulnerable persons displaced around the globe from their homes due to war, environmental catastrophe, economic disruption, ethnic and religious violence. The legacy of world religions gives hope, particularly as we at Georgetown study and know the Catholic tradition, which includes a rich history of imperatives to care for the other. Deuteronomy 10:17-19 implores care for the refugee, for the guest in your land. For the Lord your God is the great, the mighty, the terrible God. He executes justice for the fatherless and the widow, and loves the sojourner, giving him food and clothing. Love the sojourner, therefore, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. The Catholic Church has continually called for care for the other and the refugee as an intrinsic part of Catholic social teaching. Pope Benedict, in his 2012 message for World Day of Migrants and Refugees, called for an absolute duty to care for the refugee, not only as a charitable act, but as a responsibility of all nation states. He said, "Asylum seekers who fled from persecution, violence, and situations that put their life at risk stand in need of our understanding and welcome, of respect for their human dignity and rights. Their suffering pleads with individual states and the international community to adopt attitudes of reciprocal acceptance, overcoming fears, and avoiding forms of discrimination, and to make provisions for concrete solidarity, also through appropriate structures for hospitality and resettlement." Pope Francis emphasized the gospel imperative to care for the stranger in his 2016 message for the World Day of Migrants. He says, "Dear brothers and sisters, migrants and refugees, at the heart of the gospel of mercy, the encounter and acceptance by others are intertwined with the encounter and acceptance of God himself. Welcoming others means welcoming God in person. Do not let yourselves be robbed of the hope and the joy of life born of your experience of God's mercy, as manifested in the people you meet on your journey." Pope Francis's call for social friendship and solidarity is a radical call for an acknowledgement of the worth of every human person, always and everywhere, regardless of national status. At the same time, as we too are aware, these teachings are contested by some religious adherents and rejected by others who emphasize border security and limits on asylum above all humanitarian concerns. National citizenship trumps the consideration for the refugee. We will see this probably more in the coming months and years. The incoming US administration is poised to transform policies about asylum seekers at our southern border and will have massive effects on how migrants are responded to around the globe. There are significant disagreements about how to respond to the refugee within our political societies and within our religious communities. Over the course of his pontificate, Pope Francis has proposed encounter as a way to frame our responsibility to the stranger and try to help bridge this division. The creation of a culture of encounter, as he calls it, in which we can also speak with those who think differently, as well as those who hold other beliefs, who do not have the same faith. Pope Francis's call in his 2020 encyclical Fratelli Tutti was a call for a, quote, culture of encounter capable of transcending our differences and divisions, and for all persons to act as fellow travelers, sharing the same flesh, as children of the same earth, brothers and sisters all. The refugee crisis exemplifies the issues at stake in building a culture of encounter. The leading religious traditions uphold the value of hospitality and welcoming the stranger. We find faith-based NGOs among the most prominent advocates, many representatives of them here today, among the most prominent advocates for refugees around the world. In practice, however, religious adherents are so often divided on how to balance the rights of refugees, on how to balance humanitarian concern with the interests of national host communities. This conference seeks a productive dialogue around those differences to better understand what is at stake in different religious traditions' positions on refugee issues and seeking productive, humane ways forward. We aspire to help religious communities have more of a positive and material impact on refugee policy into the future, individually and together, working across difference with a shared concern for our brothers and sisters all. Along with Jocelyn Cesari, Jose Casanova, David Hollenbach, and Catherine Marshall, I am grateful for the panelists who will address these vital issues and for the members of the Working Group on Displaced Persons and Hospitality to the Stranger, part of Georgetown's Culture of Encounter project, which has been working for the past 2 years to advance the culture of encounter around a number of global challenges. This morning's first panel will be an overview of the current context and challenges at the state, international, and religious responses level. Beth Ferris, our wonderful colleague at the School of Foreign Service, will lead this panel discussion. Beth is a research professor and a director of the Institute for the Study of International Migration and a longtime distinguished practitioner in the refugee space. Beth.
Well, thank you, Michael, and we're looking forward to this day as we look at different responses by various religious traditions to the issue of refugees and migrants. This is not just a U.S. phenomena, and I should point out that the world has changed in the U.S. in the past week with respect to refugees and migrants, and I'm sure that's a theme that will come up in the discussion as we look at the context for today's session. So we're going to start by really laying out what are the issues, what are the numbers, what are the trends that we see globally, not just in the U.S., and hopefully this will set the stage then for our discussion of how communities of faith and other communities are called to respond to the strangers who arrive in their midst. We're going to begin with Anna White. Anna is the Director of Strategic Partnerships and Communication at UNHCR here in Washington. And she's going to really set the stage by looking at some of the big picture issues. Then I'm going to invite Mohammed Naeem and Faith Cooper up to the stage to offer their perspectives. We're particularly glad to have 2 former refugees on this opening panel so that we can move away from the idea that academics study refugees and really seek to co-create knowledge and understanding with people whose lives have been affected by wars, conflict, environmental catastrophes. So Anna, we'll begin with you if you want to come up here and bring your PowerPoint.
All righty, can you guys hear me okay? All righty. Okay, let's get started. It's a pleasure to be here, I'll say that first. And I'll start with a tiny personal note. I know I have only 10 minutes, so I'll run through things, but I needed to say this. My first real job on this field was with the Episcopal Church. Here in DC, I was an advocate on refugee and migrants for their office in Washington. And that gave me a complete appreciation and understanding of the amazing work faith groups do on the field. I work close not only as part of the Episcopal Church, but also with many other faith groups for several years advocating on refugee and migrant issues here. So I just want to share that to say how much value I put on the conversations that will happen throughout the day around these issues. I will also like to apologize because I will bombard you with lots of data. So I have people have coffee this morning, But I hope this will be a useful kind of starting point about the status of global displacement, if that's okay. I'll start first with the overall global numbers. This is part of our mid-year trends report we published in September. This is our kind of mid-year temperature check on data around global displacements. We issue our global trends report in June, and in September, we actually issue an update that covers until June this year, 2024. This will give you a sense of how displacement continues to move just in a very, very short period of time, and how situations have continued to deteriorate. So as you will see there, we have 122.6 million people globally displaced. This includes refugees, internal displacement, of course, 6 million Palestinians that are under UNRWA's mandate, not under UNHCR mandate. So this is the current numbers, and just to give you a sense, just in the last 6 months, or the first 6 months of the year, that meant a 5% increase from December 2023. This is additional 5 years. This is the 12th consecutive year that we see increase in global displacement every single year. And as the High Commissioner pointed out from his ExCom speech that he gave in September, this almost 123 million people that have been forcibly displaced by war, conflict, human rights violation, really deserved for us to work together towards solutions. And I think that that's a very important message. I will also like to point in terms of the displacement is the rate. To date, 1 in 67 people are displaced. This is almost double what was a decade ago, which was 1 in 114. I know, sorry for the numbers, but it's important to talk about how the level of displacement also talked about how solutions have become more difficult to find, peace more difficult to achieve, and situations, we're not surprised to this group here, has become protracted, meaning lasts more than 5 years where displacement continues. This is just to give you a sense what have continued to drive displacement. This is also from our trends report. This is just a glimpse of some situations. This is not the entirety of all the global displacement, just to point out a few that we highlight that have driven continued displacement in the last months. And you have there, of course, Sudan. I'll speak more about some of this. From Sudan to Myanmar to Ukraine, but also looking at Haiti, which is much closer to us, but just in the first half of the year, over 500,000 have been internally displaced, reaching now 700,000. This is really close to us here. Ukraine, we continue internal displacement, but also DRC, and areas where we talk maybe or is less prominent in media, if you look at where displacement is being currently reported from media. And of course, the conflict in the Gaza Strip. I'm going to keep going. Sorry about keep at the numbers, but I'll have to for the next few slides. Something that I'd like to point out that is usually in our report that sometimes is less discussed is where refugees are going. And this number is always something very interesting. 71% are in low and middle income country, and the majority stay in the region neighborhood from the place where they're fleeing. For multiple factors, of course, is proximity, ability, but also people want to stay closer to home, and the possibility that things will get better and they might be able to return with good conditions, dignity, voluntarily. 69%, like I said, in the neighborhood, that wouldn't be surprise anybody, but sometimes when we actually read about displacement or hear about it included in media, the picture might look different. And I think this is an important factor to continue to showcase. While I was just talking about solutions, there is some increase in numbers and some returns in the last 6 months compared to the 6 months in prior years, but still the levels compared to the rate of displacement is just not keeping up. So I think that's also important. We are happy to share the link to the document, which has a lot more information, and actually will actually be able to provide a better idea of where are we talking in the world for each of the situations. So now bear with me, I'll just put a flashlight on some few situations around the world. And like I said, this is just not going to give a full picture of what's happening for displaced matter, but I hope could give us a sense of the different situations that we are facing. As UNHCR, I just want to say the pace of emergencies we are responding to has also increased. In the last 3 years, an average of 40 a year. This is really has put a lot of pressure in terms of the capacity that we, and jointly with many organizations, including faith-based, of course, are responding to new emergencies throughout the world. I just included this because this is one of the latest things we're responding as UNHCR is the displacement inside Lebanon and towards Syria, which is an interesting new development given the situation we've been with Syria in the last over 13 years. But just to give you a sense of the level of the people impacted, according to the government of Lebanon, 1.2 people have been impacted, including 800,000 that has been displaced. I will stop here in a bit for the Sudan piece because it's a situation that started in April of 2023. And the significant deterioration of the conditions inside Sudan, where now you see the number there, 11.5 million people have been displaced. 3 million of people have actually fled to neighboring countries in Central African Republic, Chad, South Sudan, Egypt, but also to Libya and other countries in the region. The level of displacement is extremely high, but also the situation, the vulnerability of people that are arriving at borders is incredible. People that are walking or on the move days, weeks, arrived in the border areas and a very deteriorated status. The sheer numbers of people arriving have also mean congestions in some of the areas we're providing assistance, access to basic services, and food security, including inside Sudan, for example, is affecting half of the population. Also funding for our response, just to give you a sense for Sudan, it's really, really low. And we struggle to find attention to this situation. I also wanted to point out, sorry, I was there, that in addition to those internally displaced, that includes refugees, over 200,000 refugees that were in Sudan before this latest conflict started. Ukraine, another major displaced situation. People will be more familiar with Ukraine's situation, but this continues. I mean, just the numbers of this year that I pointed out in the first, I have a minute, I'm sorry. I'm going to have to go over, but I'll be fast. Just to say, displacement condition, very concerned about winter preparations to be able to provide assistance, given that the infrastructure for energy has been heavily impacted, and it will be much worse than the last 2 years. Sorry, how do I go back? I didn't want to forget the Myanmar, Bangladesh, just to go to another side of the world where displacements have continued since the military takeover in February 2021. The displacements have also gone up, including this year, with a significant number of internal displaced, and also a spotlight on Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh. You'll have this, so you'll be able to go back and look at the numbers and data. And I was just saying that this doesn't get to cover the entirety of the situations and displacement. I just wanted to put a spotlight in a few. Doesn't cover the Sahel, for example, where the situation also has continued to deteriorate, and we rarely hear in mainstream media, or it's difficult to actually provide a spotlight in some of these other situations. Thank you. I'm happy to then join the panel later.
Great. Thank you, Anna, for that somewhat sobering view of the numbers of people who've been displaced around the world, but also for ending on a sort of note of hope that there are people doing good things around the world who will be challenged to do even more in the coming year and years ahead. Let me invite our two other panelists, Faith Cooper and Mohammed Naeem, to join us. You can sit anywhere. And just briefly to introduce them, Mohammed Naeem is a senior strategy deputy president of the American Immigration Council, where he analyzes voter attitudes, public opinion, various trends occurring throughout the United States. He's also chair of the U.S. Refugee Advisory Board, which is a relatively new initiative to enable refugees to participate in U.S. government delegations. And Georgetown's been a part of this, and we've been delighted to see the reception of actually including refugees in policy-making roles. Faith Cooper, originally from Liberia, is currently director of the International Rescue Committee's program on the southern border, an area that's always been in hot political contention and is likely to become more so in the future. Faith is also a member of the U.S. Refugee Advisory Board. So feel free to either speak from the podium or where you are, wherever you're most comfortable, but we'll turn now to Mohammed for his assessment of the context in which we're working.
Yeah, all right. Whoa, this is really... Okay, how's that? We're good? Hi, Naveen. Some of my colleagues are here. Bring it back up. Okay, all right. Here we go. Better? Higher? Okay. All right. Good morning. Thank you, Anna, for that sobering presentation. It's data that I've already seen, but it's data that I think just reminds me of how I think just critical these discussions are in rooms like this. And of course, Beth, thank you so much. Beth has been just an extraordinary advocate for making sure that those with lived experience have a central role in shaping the contours of the kinds of dialogues that we have on these issues. So my name is Mohammed, as Beth had mentioned. My family and I came to the United States in the mid-1990s. My father was granted political asylum as part of the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979. Ultimately, a few years later, he came to the U.S., was granted asylum. And then we came by way of a family reunification pathway in the mid-90s, so a complementary pathway, as they would call it. I'll give you my perspective. Obviously, it's a real tough time right now with the election last week. But I think what happened on Tuesday has been, it's a trend that has been simmering for a number of decades, right? So I just wanted to sort of what I call, or what we call at the council and the teams that I work on, let's just expand the aperture just a little bit here, right? What we've seen over the last 12 years is extraordinary growth, as Anna had mentioned, of refugee displaced people across the world. So 122 million, 12x, so 12 straight years, 1 out of 6. The last time I checked was 1 out of every 69. That was about 2 months ago. Now it's about 1 out of 67. So it's just remarkable, the kind of growth. And I think we're going to continue to see that growth, possibly even speed up in relation to climate-induced migration across the world. So I think, so that's an expectation, that's a trend that I think will continue. And so part of what's been happening across the world is one of the things that I've been working on is just trying to understand how deep-seated our polarization is around Western democracies, particularly in Europe, in the United States. But really central to that division and polarization is the way in which elected leaders toxify the debate around these issues in ways that I think serve very much sort of their needs. So governments across Europe, and here certainly in the United States, have been taking more restrictionist posture. But that did not just begin in the last 4 years or the last 8 years. Really, it's a trend that's begun sometime around 15 to 20 years ago, particularly in the European Union, in response to migration north, and then certainly here in the United States. So let me sort of pan out the picture here. Here in the United States, we've seen a more restrictionist posture, right, around immigration issues, a little bit less so on refugee issues, but certainly on immigration issues in the Biden administration. It was in turbo drive during the first Trump administration. And and so, but that is partly a response to how the public is feeling around these issues. And I'll give you an example. Much of the data points around how the US feels on this is actually just a snapshot of how the ideological left of the United States and how the ideological right feel about these issues. But there's a vast consortium of this country who we internally call conflicted skeptics. These are Americans who don't nearly vote as much, but they are conflicted on these issues. They want to be seen as welcoming Americans. They genuinely actually see themselves as actually quite welcoming Americans. But they're conflicted around order, border, security, and that functionally does shape the kind of surround sound that underpins our issues. Now, that trend is very similar to what's happening in Europe, actually. In the United Kingdom, in Germany, in France, in the Netherlands, all across Europe, you have the left and the right ideologically battling this out, which is drowning out the sensibilities of that conflicted middle. And so what that's creating actually is a political environment, point number one, a political environment where minorities of the public are actually shaping the dominant narratives around these issues, right? And if we allow that to continue to happen, you're going to continue to see the very polar opposite policymaking apparatuses of both a left-leaning or a right-leaning government. So that's happening. So let's establish that. Now, a second layer to that is that political systems are responding to sort of that left and right sort of polarity, and they're responding with restrictionist policies. Here, we had the President Biden and his team in wanting to establish order to the southern border have taken very restrictionist policies related to immigration issues. On refugee issues, in fact, the Biden administration has been I think they've made some really positive developments. They rebuilt the refugee resettlement program in the United States. They established what we call the Welcome Corps program, which allows ordinary Americans to be able to sponsor refugees. And so there's been positive gain there. But nonetheless, though, there's been a restrictionist philosophy that's been in some way guiding their sort of political strategy on this issue. Europe just signed the European Migration and Asylum Pact, which really is an effort. I have 5 minutes. That's much more time than I thought I had. And so in Europe just passed it in April of this year. And really what that pact is a response to governments feeling the pressure of what their publics are telling them. But it's not the majority of their publics. And that to me is what I'm really struck by, is in fact, the political response and the policy apparatus is in response to what the minority of these populations feel, not actually what the majority of them feel. Anywhere between 40 and 60% of each of these countries, in fact, do not actually foundationally prescribe to that restrictionist philosophy at a policy level. And so it's a very challenging climate to be able to operate in, where the European Union decided to take a very restrictionist approach to these issues, externalize actually some of its responsibility to host countries, for example, Tunisia or Albania, and the ways in which the multilateral system in some way is allowing for that to happen, right? The World Bank and other multilateral institutions are actually participating in some measurable way in shaping that policy. And I think so we have to ask ourselves, particularly for those who work across the multilateral system and advocate across the multilateral system, what kind of levers and levels do we have to operate in to be able to, I think, reframe the conversation and reframe it in a way that allows for reasonable, sensible solutions to start to anchor itself across the international regime, because the demand side is extraordinarily high. And so as I start to think about that, so if really the public's perception isn't what the ideological left or the right feel, so if that is shaping the political posture and the policy posture, and then you have concrete policy mechanisms that are then established, then where do we go from here? And that's the question that I have to ask myself almost every single day. Where do we go from here? And here are some positive developments that I have seen, I think, across the world. So number one, here in the United States, and there are some colleagues of mine who work across resettlement agencies, the Biden administration reached 100,000 refugees resettled here in the United States this year. That is a remarkable feat. But 100,000 in the context of displacement numbers is not, it's marginal. But it's a remarkable feat because I think the last year of the Trump administration, keep me honest, I think it was about 15,000, right? It was about 15,000. So that is a multiple X increase. But that's not the complete picture, actually. So 100,000 resettled refugees here in the United States. You had 120,000 evacuated from Afghanistan. There's since been tens of thousands who have made their way to the United States by way of other pathways and programs like the SIV program, the Special Immigrant Visa Program, which was established for individuals who had supported the U.S. military operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so you have that. You have the Unite for Ukraine program, which I think has reached about 300,000 Ukrainians. You've had folks from Haiti and Venezuela and otherwise make their way to the U.S. in the hundreds of thousands. And so really what the United States over the last 4 years have been extraordinarily welcoming. And so like the numbers are clear that in fact the vast majority of this public wants to welcome the stranger. And I think I take solace in that. So and Europe and you've seen similar sorts of trends. But in addition to that, what we've seen is the growth of what we call complementary pathways. And really, the difference here are rights-based pathways. So rights-based are what's codified in the Refugee Convention of 1951, and then complementary pathways. And that includes the pathway that I came through with my family reunification. So family reunification is a pathway that's receiving a lot of international attention because I think it's something that both host governments as well as Western democracies functionally have some level of agreement towards, right? The fact that families should be reunited to the extent that they wish to. And then sponsorship. And sponsorship has taken off across the world. I think the number, both rights-based sponsorship as well as, or sponsorship writ large, I think is going to reach at the global level about 1 million folks in total, sort of by the end of this month. And so that includes both employment sponsorship, but as well as rights-based sponsorship. No, sorry, not rights-based sponsorship. It includes employer sponsorship and other community sponsored programs across the world, particularly in Europe and the United States. So what you're seeing, I think, is the international system trying to expand pathways for people to be able to find refuge in contexts across the world. But I will say, it is not enough. It is functionally not enough. And so then the third layer, and this is something that's actually quite exciting, I think, in the international system, and I'll land here and I'll pass it over to my colleague Faith, is many, many, many refugees, in fact, don't ever make their way to the United States or Italy or Germany or the United Kingdom. They stay, like Anna mentioned, in host contexts, not for years, sometimes for decades. So I think the multilateral system has a responsibility in making sure that how do you properly and appropriately and sensibly ensure that even if folks stay in that context, that they're offered the dignity of an education, the dignity of a job, right? Some semblance of a pathway in a life that is more than just staying in a tent in a camp somewhere across the world. And so what you're seeing across the world is like development actors working with humanitarian actors to be able to facilitate or be able to start to think about or sort of how to strengthen the architecture and the partnership between development actors and humanitarian actors who historically have not necessarily had deep partnership over the last many decades. But as to sort of land where I started off, which is as you're continuing to see these massive trends in displacement, you're gonna have to actually figure out how to ensure that people live in dignity in these contexts, because I don't see these trends shifting. I see restrictionist policies actually continuing across Western democracies, and I see the numbers of displaced people climbing. Something's got to give here. And if you don't actually have a response, then it will be catastrophic for these populations who are already, in fact, in catastrophic sort of levels. And like Sudan is such a powerful, powerful example of that. Gaza is horrific for all of the reasons that we know. Sudan is horrific Iran is horrific. Sudan, what's happening in Sudan is horrific in its own way. And in fact, what's often less talked about is Ethiopia and the northern region of Ethiopia in Tigray has seen extraordinary amounts of displacement. And so you're seeing actually displaced people crossing into Sudan, and then they're met with what's happening there, and then they're going to Tigray region, which has suffered through climate-induced catastrophe to a level and extent that I can't even fathom and can't even explain. And so we are dealing with these multi sort of sectoral, multi-resource, multi-political challenges, and I think we have to really be in discussion with each other about how we can meet the demands in the ways that we can, working collaboratively in partnership with actors, and I think principally also ensuring that people with lived experience have a central role in helping to design what that policy architecture could look like. Because without it, then I think you're really losing out on some really concrete sources of wisdom. So I'll end there. Thank you so much for having me, and I'll pass it over to my colleague, Faith.
Thank you. I think I'll use the podium. With 10 minutes, I want to make sure I don't miss some key points here and pick up from where Anna and Mohammed, they're a tough act to follow. So maybe we can turn off my microphone. Okay, great. So good morning. It's an absolute pleasure to be here this morning. Beth, thank you very much for the invitation. I bring you greetings from the IRSC, specifically Hans van der Veen, my supervisor. I said to him, I've received an invitation from Beth, and he said, I hope you know she's the world's foremost expert in this space. And I responded by saying, I'm absolutely honored. But as Beth noted, I am here in two capacities. One, as the regional director for the U.S. Southern Border, and some of my colleagues are here in the audience as well. And then also as advisor with the U.S. Refugee Advisory Board, and I see some of our advisors in the audience as well. It is an absolute pleasure, especially as a former refugee, as Beth noted, from Liberia. My family and I came here almost 3 decades ago at the height of the Liberian War, which claimed the lives of nearly 250,000. We believe more people, and we were fortunate to escape my country on foot, making it to neighboring Cote d'Ivoire, but also bouncing around multiple refugee camps in the West Africa region, which migration issue in that region, across that region, before ultimately resettling in the United States as a recipient of the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program. So I value that very much, and the opportunity to be able to bring that voice into this conversation. At the risk of following Anna and Mohammed, they've already emphasized the numbers, but I think it's also important to note that as we think about the 122 million, there is also another figure I want us to keep in mind, and that's the fact that 300 million people worldwide are in need of humanitarian assistance and protection. We hear about the 122 million, absolutely devastating, and of that 122 million, we know that mostly driven by protracted conflicts, Syria, Afghanistan going into 20 plus years, Somalia, Ethiopia, what's happening in Gaza and Ukraine. So I think it's important to look at some of the regional complexities and emerging crises, and just looking at conflict hotspots in Sudan, Myanmar, Ethiopia, Yemen, and the continuing displacements there, which are compounded by limited access to aid in general, making it difficult to provide adequate and sustainable support. So this morning I want to focus on future outlook and some of the long-term trends that we are seeing at the IRC. Mohammed touched on climate and migration nexus. IRC expects climate-induced migration to increase. People are fleeing due to natural disasters, drought, and various reasons. And so it requires new approaches and dynamic collaboration to be able to address the distinct needs of climate refugees, and to really look at non-traditional solutions to what's happening. We see a push for localization of aid, partnering with local organizations, especially the faith-based groups, whether it's on the U.S. southern border, whether it's in other regions, just being able to lift up those partnerships in a way that we've never seen before to ensure that we're providing culturally relevant and sustainable intervention. And interventions that have a wider impact. Because as Mohammed noted, only 1% of the 122 million will resettle and resettle with dignity. So I think it's important to look at alternative ways of supporting people in regions and in countries where they are. We also want to look at digital and innovative-driven solutions. There is a rise, it is an emphasis on leveraging technology to be able to support refugees, whether it's mobile cash transfers, remote learning for displaced children, telemedicine, you name it. It's important for us to look at dynamic and different ways of doing that. We've seen a rise of complementary pathways, labor mobility, family reunification pathways, private sponsorship, which Mohammed noted too as well. A lot of work has happened to build up these institutions, but it's incumbent upon us to be able to sustain that, and we can't sustain it without funding. Talking about opportunities, we have to now truly look at ways of partnerships beyond the traditional ways of doing it. Because we're seeing a rise in right-wing populism or nationalism globally in many countries. And we know that the first Trump administration had global implications. And that out of that was born all of these dynamic ways of being able to reach refugees and to respond to the humanitarian needs. But how can we do that without funding, without sustainable funding? So looking at labor pathways, some of it is humanitarian in nature, but the intent is to create opportunities for refugees. Looking at visa opportunities, how do we build on that? Working with the private sector, looking at business communities, being able to invest in that. There is something I'm going to talk about that's not as popular, but I think it's important that we look beyond just the south to north solutions. How about south to south solutions? Looking at what's happening in East Africa, opportunities there. So when I think about solutions, we've got to look beyond the traditional ways of looking at these areas. There is a need to focus on resilience and self-reliance, increasing trends within humanitarian agencies, including at the IRC. We're seeking to build refugee resilience. That is the fundamental, that is very fundamental in terms of the work we do, whether it's through economic empowerment, vocational training, localized interventions. We've got to be able to lift these areas up and be able to use data and evidence to sustain the work that we're doing in these spaces. Advocacy, we cannot overstate advocacy for policy change. The IRC actively engages in advocacy to push for policies at levels including local, state, federal, and global that respect refugee rights, expand asylum protection, and promote equitable funding. I want to talk about funding a bit because I think that's an area where we have in place significant needs. We know that there are funding challenges, but we're chronically underfunded in major areas with respect to humanitarian funding. And so how do we bring those resources together in an effective way? Because we know that the system is strained. Short-term funding limits long-term impact. And so stabilizing our funding is going to be critical. We need to pursue larger, long-term funding for consistent, high-quality programs, partnerships with private sector organizations that are committed to humanitarian needs, offer flexible funding for strategic and impactful programs. So I do want to say the number in need have grown tremendously, and it continues to grow each year. But the global response has failed to keep up the pace, as we've heard, in terms of what Anna and Mohammed presented. So I want to wrap up by bringing us back to the basics. There is a changing world. And changing need in a changing world really sets the stage for us to be innovative, for us to think about partnerships in a different way, for us to think about collaboration in a different way. In essence, the IRC sees the global displacement crisis as a multifaceted challenge requiring a mix of solutions, emergency response, resiliency building, policy change. And addressing these crises requires adaptability, it requires innovation, multi-stakeholder approaches, particularly with the faith-based group. We have partnered with Islamic Relief to resettle refugees in the U.S., but that is not enough. It's important that we build on those partnerships in terms of funding, capacity building, and so forth. So as we approach the ever-changing need of resettlement, asylum support, and look at this changing landscape, it's important that we bolster the funding, we bolster global cooperation. We must innovate. We must reimagine. We must look for possibilities and sustainable ways to protect people like myself who are in greatest need. I came here 30 years ago, as I said, and when I think about what my family and I went through in terms of resettlement, it's incumbent upon us to not forget about the forgotten. And I think that's the message that needs to resonate. We have a moral obligation. We have a responsibility to be that change and to work across the aisle around funding, around advocacy, around innovative, around client-informed programming in order for us to be able to continue to do this work and to protect the people who are in greatest need. Thank you.
Please, thanks to the panelists for helping to sketch the context in which we're working. We're going to open it up here for questions. I think there's some microphones that can be moved around. But let me just add 3 points to an already complex situation. First, I want to highlight the fact that most displacement today is protracted. It's more than 5 years. You know, we hear about new refugee or displacement inflows. We don't hear about people who've been either sitting in camps or on the margins of big cities for years and years. You know, back in 2000, according to UNHCR, for every new refugee, there was one refugee who found a solution, went back home or was resettled. Last year, it was for every there were 23 new refugees for every one refugee who found a solution. So if we're going to do something about these numbers, you know, one is to stop conflicts from erupting in the first place, but also to help those who've been displaced for long periods of time to find solutions. Sometimes I think that's more of a challenge than mobilizing emergency assistance for new refugees, how to deal with these long-standing situations. Secondly, as Anna pointed out, you know, over half of the world's displaced are displaced within the borders of their countries. So-called IDPs, internally displaced persons. That number too is protracted, it's growing, oftentimes because people can't make it to a border or cross into a neighboring country. Turkey, for example, has basically closed its border to Syrians, so they're backed up on the Syrian side of the Turkish-Syrian border. IDPs usually or almost always are closer to the violence that displaced them in the first place. They get much less attention, much less funding, much more difficult to provide humanitarian or even long-term assistance. So, you know, when we think about displacement, let's not just think about refugees, but also about those who are internally displaced and about those who are unable to move. I remember back in Turkey a few years ago talking with a Syrian refugee in Gaziantep who had escaped to Turkey with her mom, taking a taxi from Aleppo, and was eking out a living teaching English in Turkey. And she said, my mom can't work, but we're doing okay, but you know, my brother made it to the Netherlands. And I thought, oh, that's kind of typical, is that young, healthy men are more likely to go further. And he was doing okay in the Netherlands. And then she said, but my sister and her 4 kids are still in a basement in Aleppo. They cannot afford to even leave the city to make it to the border or to support themselves. You know, so sometimes those who are most in need of assistance are the most difficult to reach, and our systems really aren't very good at reaching those people. And thirdly, just the point that both Mohammed and Faith made, is that, you know, add climate to the mix. You know, the projections of the number of people who will move in part because of the effects of climate change are tremendous. But also climate interacts with conflict. Places like Tigray that you mentioned, this intersection between so-called natural hazards and conflict is something we really don't understand very well. But we do understand that things are probably going to have more people who are displaced and therefore more need for solutions. And maybe I disagree a little bit with Faith that maybe the answer isn't just that we need more money. All of these institutions are underfunded, but as you said too, we need fundamentally new ways of looking at these issues. And I would put the emphasis on self-reliance and less dependence on outside humanitarian assistance, and let's give these local organizations a lot more money and authority and the ability to respond to needs in their communities without always looking to the internationals. Sorry, Anna, internationals have a big, important role to play. But
Very important.
anyway, let me open it up now for a discussion. We have about, we have 45 minutes. It's really unusual for a conference to have 45 minutes for questions. So please
Is
be
that
thinking.
the time?
Yeah, so I think I
We
got
were
that right.
very good.
Let's
Yeah.
not have awkward
on time.
silence. Yeah.
No awkward silences. Yeah, I see some of my students here, and I know they're always very talkative. So we have microphone ready to go around.
Well, as you're thinking about questions, I'd just like to riff off of something you shared, Beth, which is the current design of the system. So let's peel back a little bit. When was that system designed? It was designed in response to World War II. And we saw, the world at that time saw huge numbers of folks displaced, certainly across Europe. So there was international solidarity in wanting to make sure that we created a system that met that demand at that moment, particularly as currently. But as we've seen, I think, like UNHCR, IOM, and then just a bevy of NGOs and just other organizations, I think to be just quite frank, it is difficult to continue to operate in a system that is not to say that it's ill-designed, but that the current architecture does not allow for us to meet the demand in ways that fully assesses the complexity of what we're talking about, which is the combination of drivers, which conflict, climate, and just other sort of regional and international drivers that I think that are really challenging. And then you combine that with the political posture that I had shared during my remarks, it creates for a very delicate situation. And the folks then who are hurt are obviously those who are on the move. And so I sometimes struggle, to just be transparent, I sometimes struggle as an advocate about what are the kinds of advocacy levers that I can pull to be able to make the case, right?
Absolutely.
And so, and the thing that I keep having to default to is conducting advocacy within a system that I think functionally cannot meet the demand, because to what my colleague Faith had shared earlier, which is like the resourcing, like UNHCR needs more money, IOM needs more money, everyone needs more money, but that is not, the money will fundamentally, no matter how much you give it, the money will not fundamentally solve for the system challenge, right? And so that becomes a bigger, more expansive conversation that I think we can all be a part of.
Absolutely.
And I point on this because I think that,
Sorry.
I think an interesting point here, and I think on the actors that are involved, is something that has also changed.
Right.
And I think that we need to reflect that, because I think when I was saying at the beginning, working together, what it means really, the together piece, and who is part of that together. And that also has evolved. I mean, it's not just the groups that were working with us together 20 or 30 years ago. The tent has truly expanded. And I think that we really need this. This is where the innovation piece and the different components of actually moving towards solutions is required. Beyond the political solutions and the peace solutions that are needed for many of the situations, that is not just on the response. But we now more involvement of the private sector in the levels that we have never seen before. Sports organizations, faith groups, I mean, the education institutions, being that we're in one of them also, I mean, that has also changed. I mean, the engagement that we see from many, many actors that are bringing innovation, different ideas, but also opening different opportunities for our responses, it's not only great to see, but also, I think, critical. And I think that's where I put a bit on my optimisms on what you're talking about infrastructure, because what are we moving towards is like understanding that there's no one single actor that actually can make a change. We need multiple actors working together to make this happen. And that's where I think faith communities could actually be an excellent driver, not only in mobilizing faith communities, because our different actors are not isolated. And that is what is important. They actually engage other actors. They're actually able to reach different actors. And they're able to reach different public, talking about the public per se. And that's why it is important. Funding is important, of course it is. But is the only thing? No, there will be other actors. I mean, we do depend on financial support for a lot of the life-saving work that we do. And that must remain. It will be impossible if that piece is not there. But also we must invest in solutions, working with development actors and sustainable solutions for people. But those things need to work together. And I think that I don't want to give the impression there's one or the other one.
Right.
And
Absolutely.
that cannot be. I think we work together to do all of that at the same time, because new emergencies will come up. And sad to say, they're not isolated of all emergencies or all situations. It's displacement sometimes on top of the displacement. Look at the Afghan situation, where decades of displacement, but there's new displacement. So we cannot sometimes isolate those situations in a way. So I think I remain quite optimistic when I see so many actors coming to try to figure it out, what they could bring to the table and move us forward.
Okay, Faith, and the floor is still open. We can keep talking among ourselves.
Yeah,
I'll have Faith
I
and
think
then
I'll
we'll
just
start a
add
question.
quick couple of seconds just by saying it's important to recognize, I mean, thank you for bringing up the systems piece. And absolutely, it's not just the funding. Even with all of the funding in the world, we do have to look at what's happening with the system. And I think it's important to understand that the current system as it is, it's a Band-Aid solution. Right? And we have to get away from that one-size-fit-all approach to how we respond to forced displacement. And I think that's where the faith-based collaboration and cooperation come in. At the grassroots level, being able to build those strong partnerships that will be able to withstand these challenges. And so I wanted to just lift that piece up around getting away from a one-size-fit-all approach to how we respond and looking for dynamic, innovative, sustainable ways of responding to displacement, especially meeting people where they are.
Great. I have somebody in the, sorry, I can't see your face, in the last row here, and then we'll take Courtney in the second row and Jose. Yeah.
Hi, good morning. Thank you so
Oh, yeah,
much,
that's right.
Faith, Mohammed, Anna. Your insights are really relevant for these days conversations about migration. My question actually is for Anna. You show about Sister Rosita in Brazil, how she was able to pretty much help to expand the definition of refugee. So my question is truly about the Cartagena Declaration. We know that governments in Latin America, they have been reluctant to actually apply the declaration because they don't want to see them send the wrong message that they are super welcoming. This is something that we discussed in our class. And so governments are really trying to use other mechanisms to help migrants, especially like Colombia, receiving people from Venezuela. So very much what is your reflection on this particular aspect of countries kind of walking away from the Refugee Convention? And then what is something that you could advise to governments in Latin America as they start seeing more refugees coming from West Africa, Senegalese in Argentina, Chinese coming. So there is really, it's changed a lot, the patterns of migration. So if you could speak a little bit more about that. And sorry, my name is Veronica. I am second-year graduate student from Global Human Development in SFS. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Maybe we'll go ahead and answer these one by one until we, Anna?
I'm not an expert on Cartagena definition, so you will have to bear with me with a few points that I would say. recently was the Cartagena Plus 40. It's been 40 years since Cartagena. I think that in each of the 10 marks, we have had also plan of actions that Latin America has put forward to try to look at cohesively together the countries to see ways to move forward since the first declaration of Cartagena. There's actually been very, very positive signs throughout each of the plan of actions where countries have looked at other things where Latin America has invested in refugee protection. And I think that it would be great to look at that and from that lens too, from the Mexico plan of action, the Brazil plan of action, and not what is coming with the Cartagena piece. I'm also would like to say that places you mentioned, Colombia, that have provided not only temporary protected status to over 1 million and, I don't know, 600,000 Venezuelans in the country have also provided access. That means access not only to documentation, but education and access to labor market, et cetera, which I think has been quite important and on a positive light. So I think that we need to look at the Cartagena, the evolution of the Cartagena from the 40 years and how that has played out in Latin America. So I would actually think that there's a lot of positive things to highlight on this 40 years about from the beginning until where we are now in Latin America and the different countries. Countries that also, as we say, have their own challenges on their own. So I think it's quite maybe, and it's not to do a positive spin on what you were asking, but it's true. There's a lot of great progress what I have seen. And Sister Rosita, when I visited her the first time, I met her in 2009 when there was the first resettlement program down there in Brazil. And it was an interesting experience. And she was actually quite supportive. And so there were complementary pathways being created in an area that was very new to resettlement, open up also that year from the plan of action of Brazil, which is very tied to the Cartagena. Hope that helps.
Yeah, good. Courtney? And if you could introduce yourself, that's always helpful.
Sure. Hi, I'm Courtney Morris. I'm a student with the new MIMR program, the Masters in International Migration and Refugee Studies with Professor Ferris, and grateful to be in community with Nabeen. I have a few questions. So one might be for Mohammed.
Sure.
You mentioned, I really appreciated your kind of explanation of where we're at and how we are more welcoming than we appear to be. So that was, I appreciate that. I'm wondering, I'm more aware of, ideologies on the right, but you mentioned ideologies on the left and how those have been damaging. I'm wondering what in particular. Another question I have is, we've been learning a lot in a particular class about the Grand Bargain, whereby 66% of recipients pledge to facilitate 25% of funding to local organizations. I'm wondering where maybe IRC is with that and UNHCR. I know in 2020, funding fell to 3.4%. In 2022, 1.8% to local organizations. So it seems to be going down. I'm wondering what people are doing about that. And then thirdly, what are we doing to prepare for the next admin? A lot of people are saying, organizations are saying, well, we know exactly what he's gonna do after the first admin. We're better prepared, but he's also better prepared because he had an administration of experience. And so I'm just wondering where thoughts are.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Right. You want to start, Mohammed?
Yeah, I can start. And I think, apologies if I might have misspoken. So the last 7 years of my career, I've dedicated, part of it at least, to being able to better understand the audience profiling, the audience profiles that shape public attitudes across political issues, including on migration and immigration issues. And the reason I'm putting forth sort of the left-right polarity is because they are often quite conclusively shaping the public surround sound in which these issues live in. That polarity gives off the impression that we are deeply divided as nations on this issue, when in fact that is not true. Now, the left and the right don't exactly have, so out of that context then creates for politicians, elected leaders, draw conclusions that are, I think, incomplete. For example, and I can't speak for my colleagues across my organization, and I can just share sort of where the public stands on these kinds of issues. The vast majority of Americans, and also the vast majority of folks, say, across the European Union, want some sensible policymaking as it relates to ensuring that there's predictability built into the asylum system, that there's predictability built into the humanitarian protection system, particularly as it relates to the point at which migration meets their border, right? That's where the vast majority of the public lives. And so I think so now that, no, certainly like that sensibility is, I think, like toxified, I think, by the right to an extent that sort of then really, I think, engineers a certain political calculus across both the European Union and the United States to say we have to shut down the border completely. Shutting down the border is not a policy. It is a response that drawn from the conclusion to think that will solve for your challenge. In fact, it won't solve for your challenge because across human civilization, people have always moved and they will never stop migrating. That will never stop. And so I think, and so then on the left, I think we have to have some difficult discussions about, and I hate to use the word manage. As someone with lived experience, I'm not someone to be managed. You know what I mean? And so I think like for those of us who work on these issues, in what ways can we sensibly think about ensuring that there are not order, not management, but actually how do we ensure that we create a system that is directly responsive to the needs and the protections that are allowed for under international law, right? And so even the current administration, I think particularly as it relates to the metering, for example, of immigrants to be able to be allowed into the country to actually claim asylum, that metering in some way, some can argue that goes against international law, right? And so I think how do we on across this side of the aisle start to really sort of think about an administration that is actually upholding and anchoring ourselves in international law in ways that shows where our moral compass is. Now, to your sort of, so when I say sort of the left and right, I think sort of that's really what I'm saying, is that the conclusions that are then drawn on the left is like, let's meter, and then the conclusion on the right is let's just completely shut it down. And I think if that's where you're at a policy level, then we are really setting ourselves up to fail, left and right. And so, in this administration, to touch on that, yes, I think there's been lots of punditry about, yeah, we know exactly what they're going to do, but we don't know how and how quickly they're going to do it. And I think I have a sense of what they're going to do on day one, right? But I think we have to really take stock of exactly how. And I don't have clarity as to. I mean, there are broadly a number of things that can happen. I think, in my perspective, I think like impact litigation is going to be really factorially important. I think holding the government accountable, so that means that institutions following the federal government and sort of operationally what they're doing and ensuring that we're analyzing and assessing that, and then just exposing what it is that needs to be exposed into the public into the public domain. And then I think third, which to your point, Beth, the investment in state and local infrastructure, right? And that starts with resettlement infrastructure and just other sort of needs-based support that local communities are going to continue to need. And I think that there are two parts here. It's continuing, I think, I don't know, but to the extent that we can, to be able to ensure that people are sort of provided refuge, the resettlement program. Although I think that they're gonna take an axe to that in some degree, But immigrant communities themselves who are just arrived over the last 4 years continue to need support, right? And so we have to also consider that as being as critically vital as the need to sort of defend the line a little bit. Because if we forget about the needs that immigrant communities have, then I think what we're allowing for is current crisis to create actually a much more protracted run in local communities in ways that can undermine long-term public attitudes and support for the system writ large, right? Because one of the number one, and it's striking, and the number one issue, cross faith, cross class, et cetera, Americans equate integration with speaking English across every single study that I have ever been a part of. And then there are other sort of cultural layers to that. But I think, and I'm only mentioning that not to say that immigrants should learn English. That is not a conclusion that you should draw from that. It's actually that the perception of integration is actually really, really vital in shaping public attitudes that then shapes our politics. And I think if there's nothing that you take away from that, is that I would love for us to continue to think about the ways in which public perceptions shape public attitudes and public attitudes shape the policy environment that then has certainly been undermining us all this time.
Faith, you want to tackle the grand bargain failure?
The grand bargain failure. Faith?
I definitely align with you on that, Beth. That's a great question. It's spot on. Interestingly, I did attend the World Humanitarian Summit in Istanbul in 2016, in which the grand bargain was announced, and IRC was a signatory, or is a signatory to the grand bargain. I was not with IRC at that time. I was attending, it was doing at the tail end of the Ebola response. I was in West Africa working with ECOWAS and the African Union around building preparedness, capacity of African nations to not only respond, but to prepare and mitigate around Ebola. So I was at that conference, and I think those of us working in that space took the grand bargain very seriously and felt that that was the approach in terms of the 25%. And I hate to say that, I think we failed miserably about being able, as far as being able to meet the 25%. I know at the IRC did not meet the 25%, but when you look at pockets of programs. So we're in 29 cities across the US as an organization, but we're also in 40 countries globally. And some of the countries, with respect to their country programs, some of them were able to achieve 30% in terms of funding. Take case in point, IRC's Liberia country program, of which shortly after leaving Istanbul, I became the country director for IRC in Liberia, and through our on-the-ground effort, we were able to meet 30%, but holistically, as an organization, we did not meet the 25%. So I think it called for a level of reflection, accountability, looking at how we track the work that we do with local partners. Back to Beth's point, it's beyond the funding. It's also making sure that partners have a voice in how we design, what we design, how we implement our programs. Are we just on paper saying we'll make sure partners have 25%? Or are we respecting the experience, the local capacity, understanding the cultural relevance that partners bring into the space in designing programs and making sure they're equal? Equality is important. And so I think it's beyond looking at the funding. Yes, we didn't meet the 25%. How do we take accountability for that? How do we better track? What does sustainability look like? And how do we go beyond just the percentage? Because for me, that's just a percentage on paper. What does it mean in reality when we say we're partners with local entities? And I think that's the part we need to step back and do some self-reflection about how we can do that better. And then it forces you to think about the Pledge for Change. I'm not as familiar with the Pledge for Change, but I think that's something else to keep our eyes on, as international partners have also signed onto the Pledge for Change. But what does that change look like in terms of building programs, implementing, sustaining, and the critical role that partners play into that? So I think it's important to keep an eye on it.
Anyone, Anna, you want to jump in? And also,
Yeah.
if you want to comment on, or maybe you don't want to comment on the implications.
No,
of it.
actually, I will, because actually this is something that as an organization, worked extensively on meeting the 25%, which we have. Haven't checked the last percentage, but I think that the most interesting part is not just about the percentage, it's how we actually think about localization, which actually is a very different frame of thinking about it than we had in the past. Collectively, I'm not meaning just as UNHCR, but as a broader community. This was not discussed 15, 20 years ago. I mean, not that local organizations didn't exist or local organizations didn't actually provide assistance, but how the system itself helps, supports, and actually works jointly with local organizations has become more central. And it's not just about the financial support, as you're saying, but also about training, capacity building that will stay there as situations prolong. And I think that that's quite interesting in terms of when we were discussing what they're working together, what is the different partnerships and actors in place. So I think that when we look at where conversations are, but also when practices and impact on the way we work on the ground in many locations, localization has one of the issues that have moved and in a positive way, how the entire community, all of us look at that. And in different situations, I would say the situation varies with local actors, depending on the capacity on the ground, on the prior, that it could be tapped on. I mean, it's very different what we saw in Ukraine with Ukrainian organizations, what you might have seen in other places. What I remember being in Colombia for the first 2 years of bigger arrivals of Venezuelans, the massive civil society that exists there, the network of the Red Cross. I mean, there were so many local actors, and then the community-based organizations that were organized after. That was fascinating. So I think when you look at this, it's also very context specific about how does that look like? Where are we making progress on this, taking advantage of the amazing work already being done in many situations, and where we could actually tap in where there might not be to ensure that it's there.
Absolutely.
Sure. Wait for the mic, yeah.
Thank you. Sorry, quick follow-up. So you made great points about it's not just a percentage, it's not a number, it's capacity building and what, partnerships have been made. Is there any, because the Pledge for Change then, or sorry, not the Pledge for Change,
Grand Bargain.
Yes, the Grand Bargain, I mean, they did updates, right? There was like the 2.0 in 2022. But what you're describing, is there any kind of international tracking? Because the money's being tracked, but the capacity building from a larger scale macro viewpoint, that is so critical. Is that somehow, are there metrics for that?
I'm not
Sure,
familiar.
the
if-
metrics. So go
Yeah,
ahead.
I'm not sure if there are metrics, but I think that's what the Pledge for Change may be aiming to do in terms of metrics. And I think the upcoming Pledge for Change meeting in Doha in April, I think they'll be more intentional about talking about metrics. Certainly, there's definitely a need for it if we want to look beyond funding. I would also just add 3 things that came to mind as we were having this conversation. I think looking at it in 3 key areas: reach, scale, and impact. So when you look beyond funding, are we reaching the clients that are more in need, and are we doing that with local partner? How do we scale up in communities? International partners can't be everywhere, humanitarian organizations, and we shouldn't be. We should be working ourselves out of a job. People are not happy when I say that. We should be working ourselves out of a job if we're truly living by the Grand Bargain or the Pledge for Change, and if we're focused on sustainability at the local level, right? So how do you scale from that perspective? And then impact. How do you measure your impact? So those 3 key things, scale, reach, and impact, I think are critical. And I think as we look at tracking and setting up metrics, those areas must be critical or foundational to how we're able to do an impactful and effective tracking system.
Okay, why don't I take Jose and then the woman back here? And I want you to be thinking about that question that's still hanging, the impact of a Trump administration
Yes,
on
yes.
what happened. So be thinking of your responses, but please go ahead.
Thank you. This has been a really important way to start our conversation, but it has been a very sobering picture you have given us. It's very clear that the gap between the immensity of the challenge, which is increasingly becoming worse and worse. And our responses, the gap is very big. And the question is whether we do not need to think also creatively about building new type of institutional structures which address these issues, not within the system we have. This reminds me of the words of Pope Francis in Fratelli Tutti, when he says, I've been writing this letter in the midst of the COVID crisis, and despite our hyperconnectivity, it's obvious that the global system is unable to address this challenge. Right. And so the question is, listen to you, Faith, it's very good. So we have a lot of responses, but all of them are isolated. There is no way of bringing all the refugees from Jesuit refugee services, from the different religious communities. Why can we not, each of the religious communities themselves, secular groups, why can we not think of creating structures where they can work together better, instead of staying within our own institutional structures we have now?
Yeah, that's a great point.
Okay, well, let's come back to that, but first let's hear one more question, and then we'll answer those questions.
Hello, I'm Azza Karam. I serve in Lead Integrity and as a professor at Notre Dame. It's lovely to listen to you, even though what you said has been pointed out is rather disturbing. But thank you very much, Mohammed, for the very clear outlining of the various dynamics of non-polarization, but how they translate into policies and effectiveness. I had a question for Anna. Thank you for your presentation. You gave a breakdown of 69% and 71% for the countries that are hosting a lot of the displaced folks. And it seems to me that we might be double counting, because you said low and middle income, and then you said neighboring countries. Now, a good number of the neighboring countries for those situations and conflict are actually low and middle income. And 69 and 71 doesn't add up to 100. So I just wanted you to give a chance to clarify, if you don't mind, how you calculated that. On the aspect of the World Humanitarian Summit and all of you talking about the role of faith-based, which of course is extremely critical. At the World Humanitarian Summit, for the first time, there was over 150 faith-based organizations representing various faiths, all of whom have been working with issues of displacement and migration for decades. They signed on to something called the Charter, which commits them all to not only international humanitarian law and its observance and their practices, but also international human rights law. And it was the first time that faith-based organizations came together to make that public commitment. Interestingly, when the World Humanitarian Summit was being wrapped up by the governmental and UN OCHA, every single commitment made was cited except that one. It was as if they were never there. So I'm a little bit curious as to how positive development it is that this, now we are talking about how important faith-based organizations are, when over there, when they were making their commitment and their numbers, nobody wanted to pay attention to them. If you wouldn't mind commenting on that, it would be much appreciated. Thank you.
Great, okay, comments about systemic change and about the role of faith-based organizations, and then we'll come back to the impact of a Trump administration.
Can I?
Yes, please, go ahead.
On the first question, I think that I don't want to give the impression we're not working together. I think that that's not the case. We are working together. I mean, I don't think there is an isolation between the different actors. It's not that here's faith groups, here are other groups of the civil society, here's us UN agencies, and over there private sector. I don't think that that's how it is in reality. I mean, it is true that the current situations demand of us of continue to find new and better ways, innovate, to bring more together and continue to increase. It's not the only thing that will solve the situations. It's clear that peace is needed in many places. Conflict needs to be solved. There are some things that are political kind of aspects of the situations that will actually bring solutions and unlock some of the situations we're in. But the reality is that we are working together. I don't feel like we are separate. I feel like all of us are on the same road on trying to figure it out. Where is that complementary piece about what we bring together? But there's also the parts that are new, how we innovate further, what technology brings to us, what that sector could actually help us to do. So I do think we need to continue to improve and figure these things together. What does that mean to the challenges that we're facing today? Including in your questions about what new administration will brings a lot of uncertainty about what that might bring when we look at the foreign policy pieces in relation to what it might come up with the different situations I highlighted, for example. So I'm bundling all in one question, one answer from my side. I was very interested in what the Global Refugee Forum last year, Mohammed was there, Faith too. And it was an enormous tent of people coming together and pledging to actually bring from each of their advantage points and expertise and area of work to what they could tangibly contribute. And the initiatives that are bringing different actors together, from the education piece, on what we could actually achieve together for refugee children to get to school, to get access to higher education, what we could do better on statelessness. I mean, there are so many different pieces of the pie that are working together towards those goals. Finally, can I just answer quickly the numbers? So it's very quickly. There are two different calculations. They're not like overlapping. So of the 100% of refugees, 71% are in low and middle income countries. And then when you grab the other one is 69%, I think if I remember correctly, in neighboring countries. Of course, there's overlap. Some of the neighboring countries would be low and middle income, but they are not double content. Just as two different statistics that showcase a bit where populations are, which I always try to highlight because I think that they tend to demystify it a bit, like what is the sense that some people might have about where refugees might be going when they're fleeing their countries. So I hope that clarifies the statistic piece.
I would like to add to your question. All right. I like to be a bit provocative here. And we are applying humanitarian solutions that are off, at least to this point, and that are increasingly driven by political realities. So, like, there's a mismatch there. Right? The multilateral system is applying humanitarian solutions to what are inherently political challenges. Gaza, for example, is an example of that, very clearly, point blank. The toxicity around its politics has shaped, created, driven the conditions that we are seeing horrifically on our screens in Gaza, and certainly in the West Bank. And you're seeing that obviously play out in Sudan. You're seeing that play out in Ethiopia. You obviously saw that play out in Syria, Afghanistan, Ukraine, et cetera. So we have to ask ourselves, if we continue to apply humanitarian solutions to what are inherently political problems, geopolitical and political realities, how do we solve for the humanitarian challenges? So then it gets me back to, okay, if that's a downstream reality, the upstream reality is that across national publics, right, the wrongful conclusions are being drawn from the sort of the sentiments that these publics feel. And so I have to think then even further up to say, who are some key trusted actors and messengers that can shape the contours of what that dialogue could look like? And I know that I created like a clear symmetry there, but it is important for us to clearly construct what that spectrum is actually, what it functionally looks like. And so I think faith communities have a huge and a key role in actually shaping the contours of the dialogue that nation states are having within their own societies. And both across the political advocacy space, but also just generally they have a moral responsibility to be able to functionally serve as key and trusted messengers for their not just those who are walking into your places of worship, but actually functionally the public at large. When I think about the social and civic movements of the 1960s and even before that, faith had an extraordinarily powerful role, in fact, in movement building. But what you're seeing actually parallel to what is happening across countries is that there's increasingly like national publics are increasingly prescribing less to any faith denominations, right? And so I struggle with so it's this sort of web of complexity that I really start to functionally think about. And so to your question is, I think if we continue to apply humanitarian solutions, which are inherently politically in dimension, I think it causes me to really question the current architectural makeup of the entire system.
Just wait for the microphone.
I think that's where the sound is.
Faith institutions are, most of them, transnational institutions. And they have in their means the possibility of creating transnational structures, not only advocacy within national structures. As long as we think that the solution is within national structures, we can't have no solutions, nor the international system of states, which is based on national structures. So unless we create transnational structures within civil society, we will not be able to address those issues.
And just to add to the contours of the dialogue space, I mean, Faith talked about it a bit more than I did, but I serve with my colleague Nabin and Faith here on the U.S. Refugee Advisory Board. For the last couple of years, we've had a refugee advisor on U.S. government delegations to major international convenings, including the Global Refugee Forum, the executive committee meetings for the last 3 years, the consultations on resettlement and complementary pathways in Geneva, which happens every June. And so what you're seeing actually is this remarkable collision, right? You're seeing people who have real stake and are sort of have known the sort of the really concrete ways in which their lives have been shaped by political decisions that have been made on floors like in the Palais in Geneva and certainly here in the UN in New York and otherwise. And so what you're seeing is a system have to react or be in the same room as people who have faced the implications of the decisions that have been made in rooms like that. And that collision is occurring right now across the system, right? And I think that offers, an opportunity to hold accountable the system to ultimately the people that are facing the realities of the kind of decisions that are being made in rooms like this. And so it's been, a really, really important movement, I think, for the entire international system to begin to be held responsible politically and humanitarian and on humanitarian grounds in the ways in which it is continuing to fall short, and to hold that. And to your point, faith communities have an important role in also being transparently and accountable, ensuring that they are holding accountable the sort of the governments and the multilateral institutions that are certainly have sort of a huge sway over the world that or the system that we continue to sort of have.
Okay, last word for you, and we only have 5 minutes left, and I note that nobody has tackled the question yet. What Trump is going to do. I'll take that.
I'll pass it on to my colleagues over here.
Oh,
I'm kidding. But so coming back to your question about the charter and the grand bargain, that critically important piece of it not being mentioned. I thank you for sharing that and acknowledge that. But at the same time, I think we've got to be careful not to separate, and I think my colleagues touched on it a bit here, separate faith-based group from civil society. And I think when we do that, it dilutes the work that's happened over generations between other partners within the community as well as faith-based groups. I think we cannot empower people in crisis without the faith-based community. I think you would agree. Nowhere have we been able to empower people in crisis without relying heavily on the faith-based community. And so I wanted to lift that point up because it comes down to strengthening local support systems. It comes down to working at the community level and recognizing the needs of our clients. And those needs are deeply rooted in faith-based community. I think about my own family resettling to the United States, and the faith-based community was absolutely critical in helping my mother to be able to integrate, but also not lose her cultural relevance. And so when I think about that, I want us to be careful not to separate the two when we talk about civil society organizations and partnerships, because it's very dangerous for us to do that. It requires that kind of partnerships we've had for decades. It requires us to come together and be unified, but also we have individual strengths within these respective humanitarian organizations. But how do we build on that and do that in a way that's going to be more needed now, coming back to this question we're about to answer, hopefully, that's going to be more needed now in an environment that's absolutely polarized. So I think it's important to keep that at the heart of everything that we do.
Yeah, I'll just say a few words about what I think. I have absolutely no contact with people planning the new Trump administration, but I think there are several things we can expect. Much more attention to the border. There will be more troops, more militarization, more wall or physical barriers. I think we're going to see tremendous pressure on Mexico. Of all the countries in the world, I'm most worried about Mexico in terms of the pressure the U.S. could bring to bear in terms of its economy and politics and so forth. And it's already brought to bear over the years. I think we're going to see a real fear and panic among the undocumented population in the U.S. with this threat of mass deportations. I don't think anybody thinks that we can actually deport 11 million people, but I think he will make an effort in the first week to show that he's taking this seriously. And I also worry about so many families that have mixed statuses, where the kids may be U.S. citizens, but their parents are at risk of deportation. I worry about that for some of our students here in Georgetown in that situation. In terms of, kind of our work internationally, the first Trump administration didn't see a major decrease in funding for overseas assistance. UNHCR, I think, actually ended up getting a little bit more. Yeah. Maybe on this rationale that let's keep them satisfied over there so they don't come here, or maybe because of the strong history of bipartisan support for humanitarian assistance. But I worry a lot about UNRWA. I mean, the Palestinian agency, where we've seen both Israeli restrictions. I don't think the U.S. will resume funding. Will it continue in another form? Will other countries step up, given the horrific needs in Gaza right now? I mean, I think we ought to be paying a lot of attention to what happens to UNRWA. And then there are all the systemic changes, the impact on the judiciary. I worry about things like PBS and NPR, and particularly with Elon Musk in this position, possibly a crackdown on alternative sources of media. What's the impact on the Department of Education and funding for student loans, for example? I think the ripple effects could be huge. Anyway, so I think it's a time when we need to think about all of this. In my class this week, we talked about, should NGOs and civil society resist? Continue to make the case even if their arguments aren't going to go very far, or retreat, or maybe focus more on those most impacted by these decisions and working more locally than the national campaigns. I think those are legitimate questions for an advocacy community that frankly is quite exhausted. And is there the energy to mobilize when it may not make much difference in the immediate scheme of things? Or do those symbolic acts of resistance serve as witness and encouragement of those who are affected? So in this opening panel, we've tried to set the context for the discussion to come. We've talked about the numbers and the growing humanitarian need. We've talked about attitudes, how our attitudes change, and perhaps the challenge for future discussion is how do faith communities shape attitudes? One of the few places in the U.S. where you have people of different political persuasions, often in the same communities. And then we've talked about the need for systemic change, a recognition that our present humanitarian system simply isn't fit for the challenges that we're facing today. And hopefully there's something that faith communities can contribute to that as well. So thank you to all the panelists, and thanks to all of you. And now it's time for a well-deserved cup of coffee and maybe some sweet back there.
Thank you, Beth. This is great. Thanks.